Hi, I'm Fristelian, and in this guide I'll be covering the things you need to know to optimize your performance as Unholy using Runic corruption. With a rotation this simple, there isn't really anywhere you can go to change it drastically. The only variable is death coil. In my first guide I said that in order to keep yourself out of trouble, you should never use death coil before using runes. And whilst this does do good DPS, to fully optimize we need to be fishing for Runic corruption procs at every opportunity. This is risky because this means we are using sudden doom procs instantly, and we're death coiling whenever we can. We don't want to cap any resources, and yet this seemingly small structural change inevitably results in rune desync, and that can escalate into substantial DPS loss. So what do I mean by desync? Well, as you know, rune pairs only recharge one at a time, and as long as we spend its paired rune before the other recharges, we won't interrupt the flow. Since Festering Strike uses both blood and frost runes at the same time, we need them to always recharge together. If there is a delay between these runes, then that gap, or desync, is pushing back the rate at which we can use Festering Strike. And less runes spent means less runic power generated, directly reducing the rate at which we can death coil, which is how we get runic corruption, in turn reducing the total number of runes available for the encounter. And this mess is why I was saying to never death coil before runes. Fortunately, desyncing is going to show up in the same place in the rune cycle, and this gives us options to mitigate it. But first, we need to flesh out the problem. It occurs when we are trying to spend frost death runes on Scorch Strike. This is because of how the game chooses the rune order. It always goes Unholy, Blood Death, Frost Death. And what happens is that we spend the Unholy and Blood Death rune, but the other rune set finishes recharging and blocks in the Frost Death rune. There are a myriad of reasons and rune combinations that all arrive at this exact same situation, which is what makes it such a persistent problem. But they all reduce down to the same two answers, but they have different costs. Option 1 is to immediately Festering Strike, and then Scorch Strike. That will limit the delay to the desync, but will result in dephased runes. Dephasing is worse than desyncing because it returns runes that you cannot spend optimally. You can Scorch Strike the available death runes, but this leaves the returning normal rune unused, which is known as an orphan. An orphaned rune is the greatest DPS loss because it removes that rune from use, making it the longest desync you can put to the rune cycle. And because the orphaned rune is normal and the returning runes are dephased, the same choice will be given to you every time. And each time you pick Festering then Scourge, you will orphan an alternate rune, utterly crippling your DPS. So you will be required to Festering Strike 2 to 3 times in total, until all Blood Frost runes are death before returning to Scorch Striking. The cost incurred is in overwriting the death runes. This might sound like the worst option, but in reality it's the best decision over the long term. But not only is it simple, it uses all the runes, which means we don't lose any death coils. And if you're using Necrotic Plague, the extra festers are easily absorbed. Option 2 is to Scorch Strike out all the death runes. That will add upwards of 1 second to the desync, with the potential of orphaning and dephasing if the delay is so long that a rune recharges. Whilst this clears all the death runes, any additional delays can result in rune timers being significantly distorted, slashing your DPS. However, it's possible that this will result in a desync of only 2 seconds, which is tolerable, but it's very risky. So whilst this generally costs more to repair, it is the clear winner in times where you need immediate damage. When the desync is several seconds long, it needs repairing, and I found an easy way to recover your runes where dephasing actually becomes the solution to desyncing. So we wait till the point in the cycle where we get normal runes recharging onto death runes, as I've just been talking about, and then intentionally block in the Frost Death rune, and fester out the normal runes. We then Scorch Strike every rune except the pair of the leading rune, in this case Blood, at which point we cap and hold that pair, wait until the trailing rune has caught up, and then Scorch Strike the death rune. This will put all the runes back in phase and sync. There are inherent costs to resetting, but I find it far less damaging over time than trying to play with screwy runes. If you miss the timing and put the frost pair a little ahead, it's not a huge problem, because the blood rune can never be trapped, so everything will work itself back to being flat, eventually. And in general, prevention is far better than cure, so if you can see a desync coming, preserving things by festering out early is usually the best option. The first few abilities used determines your potential DPS for the entire encounter. We need to drop those runes as quickly as possible so our options aren't huge. You either lead Unholy with Scourge Fester, or lead Blood with Fester Scourge. Such a small change has a dramatic effect on the flow of a fight, and be damned if you get a delay between those first two casts. But when it comes to frost locking, both of these share the same point of failure, the third global cooldown. You can Scourge Strike the Unholy Rune first, and the Blood Death second, but you are then locked on the Frost Rune. And the same goes for the Festering opener. You first hit the Blood Death, but the Unholy Rune recharges next, and so your second global cooldown goes on the Unholy Rune, and you are again locked on the Frost Rune. So if the entire problem is there because it's on the third global cooldown, why not just change it? But being blocked behind Blood means it can never be first, so why not second, and remove all the risk of ever being capped? Well, that's actually really easy. All you need to do is open with Festering Strike twice, and then Scourge Strike. This now means that Unholy is the only rune that is likely to get capped, and since Scourge Strike will always take the Unholy Rune first, it can never be locked. It's not really practical to reset any delays to the Unholy Rune, so that can get as wonky as you like. Don't get me wrong, delays will still lower your DPS, but now they don't utterly destroy it. So this is about everything I can give you for troubleshooting the main rotation. Ultimately, managing when to death coil is your own judgment. So now let's take a more in-depth look at talents. We'll start with Plague Leech. Plague Leech works by taking two fully depleted runes and turning them into death runes. Fully depleted means that both runes are down, but be careful not to waste it because it will work with one rune down. Just make sure you have the time to spend the runes without capping either runes or runic power, and try not to leech back death runes. This means you should use it directly after you finish Scourge Striking a set of death runes. That will take 6 seconds in total and provide 50 runic power. You are guaranteed to cap everything if you proc Runic Corruption, so don't death coil. When paired with Defile or Breath, we use normal diseases, and we are removing them every 30 seconds, so the Festering Strike extension has no value, making it very important to use every death rune correctly, and then put diseases back as soon as you can, which means Outbreak after you finish the Scourge Strikes because it takes a global cooldown you just don't have. Otherwise, use Plague Strike. It's possible to turn the Unholy Rune into death using this talent, which is known as Reaping. You simply make sure that you have either a Blood or Frost Rune up and the other two are down and leech. Then you can keep the Unholy Rune as death by using Blood Boil or Festering Strike. This is very handy for sustained AoE fights where Scourge Strike is less DPS than Blood Boil. But it's important that if you are starting the AoE with Leech, that you Blood Boil diseases first before you leech. Otherwise, you won't have any to either spread or quickly replace back onto your target. These runes have high AoE value, and we can only reap one Unholy Rune every 25 seconds. We can maintain them for short periods between AoE phases thanks to our Festering Strike lead, because the Blood Frost runes will be death and are returning before the Unholy Rune is available. Spend the Blood Death rune on the Unholy abilities and hold the Frost Death, and then as the Unholy Death returns, Festering Strike it with Frost Death. You can only do this once per set, but that can be enough to bridge the gap, or reapply Death and Decay. Unholy Blight. This is naturally paired with Necrotic Plague, and pointless to take if you haven't. Unholy Blight rapidly stacks Necrotic Plague over 10 seconds, or 9 if you cast Outbreak during, but Blight has a cooldown of 90 seconds, which means we need to extend Plague's duration to end as soon as possible after the cooldown is up. Landing within a few seconds of this consistently is really quite doable with a little practice. In fact, if things go well with Runic Corruption procs, you won't have to use any extra festerings during the loop at all, and might even find you exceeded it. However, it usually requires a little management. The timers break down like this. We need Plague to hit 90 seconds. It starts with a base time of 30 seconds, so we need to extend it by 60 seconds. Conveniently, Festering Strike extends diseases by roughly 6 seconds, so that's 10 Festering Strikes. We have a core rotation loop of 28 seconds, in which we Festering Strike twice. So 3 times 28 equals 84. So we naturally cast 6 Festering Strikes during this time, getting a 36-second extension built in, and potentially 1 Festering Strike extra at the end depending on which runes we used at the start. But basically, this means we are only short 4 Festering Strikes. And because Runic Corruption acts to shorten that natural cycle, we really don't need that many procs to exceed 90 seconds without using any death runes on Festering Strike. Of course, this is with 100% uptime, so most of the time you will have to use extra Festering Strikes, just not as many as you probably thought. But because of Corruption's randomness, it isn't possible to know exactly how many extra Festerings you might need. Therefore, the optimum way to handle this on sustained single target is to defer any decision making by simply waiting for Necrotic Plague's duration to decay down to around 10 seconds and then festering as needed until you hit the 90-second mark. However, this choice to delay is also not without risks, because if you have to deviate for any length of time, Plague will drop off early, which is a catastrophic DPS loss. So usually, to mitigate such risks, it will pay to front load the duration for safety, and the easy way to do that is to add in 2 to 3 extra festering strikes early on. Obviously not while being affected by potion and ring, but as soon as you can thereafter. It's just basic insurance, because overrunning is so much better than dropping early. One of the main drawbacks to Runic Corruption is its lack of options when it comes to planning within encounters. Say we need AoE at a certain point, we must turn both sets of runes into death 14 seconds ahead of time because we can't count on a corruption proc to do it sooner. And then it will probably proc anyway, but we have to keep festering, otherwise you could end up without death runes when you need them. It can become quite frustrating, but those extra festers will keep Plague ticking whilst you AoE, so it sort of works itself out. The same rule applies when it comes to planning single target burst. The most rune damage we can put out is 6 scored strikes in a row, so when you know a crucial burst switch is coming, you have to sacrifice a little DPS beforehand. To optimize the switch further, it helps to know how long the thing will be alive for. If it's a fast switch, where the add will rapidly drop under 45% health, then use Soul Reaper early to make sure it triggers in time. But if it's dead in like 6 seconds or less, don't bother. If you're using Unholy Blight, you can factor in the inevitable extensions to Plague through the extra festerings you get during prep to avoid excessive Plague durations. But you are rather at its mercy because Plague is the bulk of the damage, so you might have to extend it even longer than usual to cover several sets of adds or other mechanics rather than dropping off at exactly 90 seconds. This is all preferable to having to rebuild with Unholy Blight during AoE, which is a massive DPS loss. In fact, if you find yourself on an encounter constantly having to fester prep for AoE, you might find that Plague Leech will suit you better since you are never actually dropping Necrotic Plague at any time, and it will instantly be bounced back onto the target anyway. Whilst this is an advanced guide, I still don't recommend you take Breath, as it's incredibly frustrating to use because what it needs is consistency, which is impossible with Corruption's randomness. Every tick of Breath now only has a 22.5% chance to trigger Runic Corruption rather than 45% from Deathcoil. I've had one Breath last nearly a minute with crazy RNG, but the vast majority of them will crash out in around 10 seconds. That's totally pathetic when compared to Blood Tap, and especially now that you're trying to line it up with the legendary ring, it's just a recipe for madness. But if you do insist, then it's pretty simple to set up. You pull Runic Power from 3 sets of runes to get 90, then hold a set of runes to the next set are within easy hitting range, trigger Breath, spend all the pooled runes, EMP and Leech when you run out, and pray for Runic Corruption proc. Personally, I gave up on this crap when Corruption procced on the first tick, capped all the runes, and then never procced again. But I'll have a detailed explanation of how to get the most out of Breath when I do the Blood Tap guide. Lastly, Plague. I've covered the bulk of the gameplay changes for Necrotic Plague during Unholy Blight, but there are some nuances worth mentioning. One is that it really helps to have one long-lived target that you can tunnel Festering Strike into to build time on, and then use them to spread that plague to everything throughout the encounter. But when you lack a central target, you will have to bounce it around with Blood Boil as you go. It's worth talking about Blood Boil here, as it transfers diseases in a 15-yard radius of you, meaning you can hit adds up to 30 yards away from your plague carrier if you run out to form a bridge between them. Since the bulk of your damage is keeping plague on all the things, it's important you get a feel for the distance. My final point is that every time you extend Necrotic Plague with Festering Strike, you are deferring damage into the future, and the only way to access that damage is by having that Necrotic Plague expire. So you should be ending every fight with Unholy Blight on cooldown and with as little time left on Plague as possible. And it's this way of deferring your maximum DPS to where and when you want it that makes encounter planning with Necrotic Plague so rewarding. But that is another topic entirely. So that concludes this guide. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching.